I want her to leave the house, but she brought a new boyfriend instead. Then I decided everything, and I never imagined that at 45 years old, I'd still be cleaning up after my daughter, dealing with her mood swings, and struggling to keep my home from turning into a disaster zone. When I had Madison, I thought I was raising a daughter who would grow into a responsible, hard-working young woman with dreams, ambition, and at least a fraction of gratitude for everything I had done for her. Instead, I ended up with a 21-year-old freeloader who refused to lift a finger, constantly mooched off me, and acted like the world owed her something just for existing. Every morning, I woke up exhausted from working 2 jobs, dragging myself through the front door with aching feet, only to find dirty dishes piled up in the sink, food containers scattered across the living room, and her clothes, tossed around the house like she was living in a hotel with a cleaning staff at her beck and call. The smell of old takeout mixed with her cheap perfume and whatever incense she burned to cleanse her energy made me sick to my stomach. Every time I confronted her about the mess, she acted like I was attacking her soul, like I was some cruel, heartless villain trying to crush her free-spirited existence. "You just don't get it," she always said, rolling her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. "I don't need to live by your capitalist rules, Mom. I refuse to be a slave to the system like you." That was her favorite argument, her excuse for refusing to work, refusing to contribute, refusing to do anything but lay around the house, scroll through her phone, and invite random men over whenever she felt like it. Madison convinced herself that she was some kind of enlightened being, above the responsibilities of ordinary people, while I was the pathetic fool killing myself just to keep the lights on and a roof over our heads. It wasn't just her laziness that drove me insane. It was the complete lack of respect. If she wanted to waste her own life, that was one thing, but she had no problem making my life miserable in the process. She never lowered her voice, no matter how many times I told her I needed sleep before my next shift. She played music at full volume in the middle of the night, argued with her revolving door of boyfriends at 2 in the morning, and screamed at me whenever I asked her to do the bare minimum, like washing her own damn laundry or picking up after herself. Every argument ended with her storming out, slamming her bedroom door, and acting like I was the worst mother in the world for daring to expect basic human decency. The worst part was, she had no shame about any of it. She genuinely believed that she deserved to be taken care of, that I owed her everything, and that I was somehow the selfish one for expecting her to act like an adult. I tried everything: gentle conversations, tough love, ultimatums, but nothing worked. She twisted everything I said into a personal attack, accusing me of being toxic, controlling, and unsupportive of her journey. One night, after coming home from my second job, I found her sprawled out on the couch, wearing one of my expensive robes, eating food that I had bought, and talking loudly on the phone with some guy about how she was thinking of getting a 3rd tattoo. The sight of her living in pure entitlement, completely indifferent to how exhausted I was, made something snap inside me. I stood there, gripping the strap of my work bag so hard my knuckles turned white, and I told her, "Enough. I'm done with this. You need to get a job or move out. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here if you refuse to contribute." She didn't even look up from her phone. She just smirked and said, "You always say that, but you'll never actually do it. You need me here, or you'd be lonely and miserable." Her words knocked the air out of my lungs. Not because she was right, but because I realized, in that moment, that she truly believed she was untouchable. She had no fear, no sense of consequence, no understanding of how close she was to pushing me past the point of no return. She thought she could do whatever she wanted, that I would always put up with it, that I would never find the strength to actually make her leave. For weeks, I tried to hold my ground, refusing to give her spending money, ignoring her tantrums, and making it clear that I wasn't going to keep playing her game. But then she brought Jackson home, and everything got so much worse. Jackson was the kind of man who walked into a room and made it feel like the walls were closing in. He had that dangerous, cocky smirk, the kind of guy who thought he was invincible, who lived like rules were suggestions and consequences were for other people. I'd seen plenty of men like him before. Men who thought they were smarter than everyone else, who thrived on chaos, who took what they wanted and left destruction in their wake. The second he stepped into my house, I felt an overwhelming urge to throw him out. He made himself comfortable immediately, spreading his legs wide on my couch like he owned it, kicking his dirty boots onto my coffee table, and giving me a lazy nod like I was some hotel maid he barely acknowledged. Madison giggled at everything he said, clinging to him like he was the greatest thing that had ever happened to her. And for the first time in my life, I felt real fear, not just frustration or exhaustion, but the deep, stomach-churning fear that this man was going to destroy what little control I had left over my own life. Within a week, Jackson was here constantly. He ate my food without asking, left his greasy fingerprints on my kitchen counters, and filled the house with the stench of cigarettes and motor oil. He didn't respect me, didn't acknowledge me, didn't care that he was an unwelcome intruder in my home. Madison, of course, defended him every time I tried to push back, telling me I was overreacting and being judgmental. The final straw came when I overheard them whispering in the kitchen late at night, their voices low and conspiratorial, followed by Madison's obnoxious giggling. I wasn't stupid. I knew something wasn't right. The way Jackson watched me, the way he smirked when I walked by, the way Madison had started keeping her bedroom door locked at all times, it all made my skin crawl. I had ignored the red flags with my daughter for years, but this wasn't just about her anymore. I needed help, and I knew exactly who to call. The moment Jackson entered my house, I could feel something shift, something dark and insidious settling into the walls like mold. I had dealt with a lot from Madison over the years, her laziness, her entitlement, her complete lack of respect for anyone who didn't cater to her every whim. But this was something different. This wasn't just another mooch who was going to eat my food and leave his dirty laundry all over the house. This was a man who carried danger around like a second skin, a man who knew exactly how to manipulate a situation to his advantage. At first, I tried to set boundaries, not that I expected either of them to respect them. I told Madison, as firmly as I could without immediately triggering one of her tantrums, that Jackson wasn't allowed to stay overnight. She rolled her eyes, laughed in my face, and told me I was being ridiculous, acting like some overbearing mother from the 1950s who couldn't handle her daughter having a social life. Jackson just smirked, leaned back against the kitchen counter like he owned the place, and made some offhand comment about how I needed to relax and learn to trust my daughter. That night, I went to bed seething, gripping my blanket so tightly I thought I might rip it apart at the seams. When I woke up, the first thing I saw was Jackson's leather jacket draped over my couch, his boots kicked off in the middle of the living room, and his motorcycle helmet sitting right next to my purse on the kitchen counter. I didn't bother waking them up. I had to leave for work, and I was too exhausted to fight the same battle I had been fighting for months. But when I came home that evening, stepping through the door with sore feet and a pounding headache, my heart nearly stopped at the sight in front of me. Madison and Jackson weren't just lounging around the house like they had no responsibilities. They had company, a group of bikers sprawled out on my furniture, drinking my beer, and making themselves at home like they had been living there for years. The smell of cigarettes, cheap cologne, and sweat made me gag. The sight of my coffee table covered in fast food wrappers and empty bottles sending a wave of nausea rolling through my stomach. Madison didn't even look embarrassed when I walked in, didn't flinch at the way my entire body tensed up, didn't care that she was turning my home into some kind of makeshift clubhouse for men I had never seen before in my life. She just gave me that same smug look she always had, that look that told me she knew I wouldn't do anything about it. I stood there, gripping the strap of my purse so hard my fingers ached, trying to decide whether I should start screaming or just turn around and walk back out the door. Before I could make a decision, Jackson stretched his arms over his head, letting out a lazy yawn before giving me a slow, taunting grin. "You're home late," he said, like it was his place to comment on my schedule, like I was the guest in his house instead of the other way around. "Rough day at work?" Something inside me snapped, something raw and furious and filled with years of resentment toward the ungrateful, selfish daughter I had raised. I threw my purse onto the counter, took a deep breath, and forced myself to speak in a calm, even tone that barely disguised the rage bubbling beneath the surface. I don't know who the hell you think you are, but this is my house, not yours, I said, staring directly at Jackson and refusing to let him look away. I worked my ass off to keep this place running, and I will not come home to a bunch of strangers treating it like their personal hangout spot. For a brief moment, I thought I had made my point. One of the bikers shifted uncomfortably. Another one cleared his throat and glanced away, like even he knew this had gone too far. But Jackson? He just smiled, slow and deliberate, like he was amused by the whole thing, like I was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his otherwise perfect evening. "Relax, Vanessa," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, dragging my name out like it was a joke. "We were just having a little fun. No harm done. No harm done." I looked around my house, taking in the mess, the way my personal space had been invaded, the way Madison sat there laughing at my frustration like this was some hilarious prank at my expense. I thought about the hours I spent on my feet, working 2 jobs to support a daughter who refused to lift a damn finger, the sacrifices I had made just to keep a roof over her head, and I realized, in that moment, that I was done. "I want all of you out of my house," I said, my voice sharper than I had ever let it be before. Right now, for the first time, Madison's smug expression cracked, her eyebrows pulling together in something close to panic. She had never heard me talk like that before, never seen me stand my ground without immediately backing down at the first sign of one of her tantrums. "Mom, don't be dramatic," she said, standing up and crossing her arms like she was the one in charge, like she actually believed she had any authority over me. "It's just a few friends hanging out. You're overreacting, as usual." I took a step forward, meeting her eyes with a look that made her hesitate, made her shoulders tense up just slightly, just enough for me to know that I had finally gotten through to her. "I am not overreacting," I said, my voice steady and firm. "I have been patient, I have been understanding, and I have given you more chances than you deserve. But I am done. You either start respecting my house, or you leave." Silence. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, the weight of my words settling over the room like a storm cloud about to break. Jackson was the first to move, standing up and stretching like he had all the time in the world, giving me that same slow, lazy smirk that made my skin crawl. "Come on, Maddie," he said, grabbing his jacket and tossing it over his shoulder. "Let's get out of here. Your mom's clearly having a bad day." Madison hesitated, glancing between me and Jackson, torn between the 2 worlds she had built for herself. The one where she could do whatever she wanted with no consequences, and the one where she had to finally face reality. And then, just as I had started to think she might actually listen, she rolled her eyes, scoffed, and grabbed her purse. "Whatever," she muttered under her breath, brushing past me without another word. The door slammed behind them, rattling the walls, leaving me standing in the middle of my ruined living room, surrounded by the wreckage of everything I had worked for. I should have felt relieved that they were gone, that my house was finally empty, that I had stood my ground and refused to let them walk all over me. But I didn't, because deep down, I knew they'd be back. And next time, I needed to be ready. I barely slept that night, lying in bed with my jaw clenched and my mind racing, thinking about how I had let things spiral so far out of control. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jackson sitting on my couch like he owned it, his smug grin burning itself into my memory, his voice dripping with condescension as he dismissed my anger like it was nothing more than background noise in his perfect little world. Madison had always been difficult, always been selfish, always been impossible to reason with, but Jackson was something else entirely, something darker, something more dangerous. I woke up to a house that still smelled like cigarettes and sweat, even after I had spent an hour cleaning up the mess they had left behind, scrubbing the counters, picking up empty beer cans, and tossing the remains of their greasy fast food into the trash. The house was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that presses against your skin like a warning, reminding you that things weren't over just because they had walked out the door. I had told myself, over and over again, that I was done, that I wouldn't let Madison drag me down with her, that I wouldn't let her mistakes become my responsibility. But deep down, I knew the truth. She wasn't going to stop. She wasn't going to change. She wasn't going to wake up one morning and realize that she had been treating me like garbage for years. And if I didn't do something real, something permanent, then I was going to be stuck in this endless cycle forever, fighting the same fights, having the same arguments, cleaning up the same messes. I made the decision before I even realized I had made it. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand, scrolled through my contacts, and found the name I hadn't seen in years, the name I had never expected to need again. Lucas. I hesitated for only a second before pressing call, pressing the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone stretch out like a tightrope beneath my feet. It had been over 2 decades since we had last spoken, since high school, since the days when life had been simpler and the biggest problems I had were exams and teenage heartbreak. Now, he was a detective, a real one, not the kind that sits behind a desk filing paperwork, but the kind who had seen things, who had dealt with people like Jackson before, who knew exactly how to handle a situation like this without making it worse. Vanessa? His voice was rough, tired, the voice of someone who had been dealing with other people's messes for far too long. Didn't expect to hear from you after all these years. What's going on? I swallowed the lump in my throat, gripping the phone tighter as I forced myself to speak, forcing the words out before I could second-guess myself. I need your help, Lucas. It's about my daughter. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out just long enough to make my stomach twist, just long enough for me to start wondering if I had made a mistake. Then, finally, he sighed. The kind of sigh that carries weight, the kind of sigh that comes from someone who already knows they're about to be dragged into something messy. Tell me everything, he said, his voice steady, calm, the voice of someone who wasn't easily rattled. So I did. I told him everything, every detail, every red flag, every gut feeling that had kept me awake at night. I told him about Madison's refusal to work, her tantrums, the way she had been using me for years without a single shred of guilt. I told him about Jackson, about the way he had walked into my home like he belonged there, about the bikers, about the stolen mail, about the missing money, about the receipts I had found stuffed in Madison's purse with names that didn't belong to her. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking, my throat dry, my body tensed like I was bracing for impact. Lucas didn't speak for a long time, letting the weight of my words settle, letting me sit in the silence, letting me feel the full gravity of what I had just admitted. When he finally did speak, his voice was lower, more serious, the kind of voice that made it clear this wasn't just a casual conversation between old friends. You were right to call me, he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Jackson's been on our radar for a while. He's bad news, Vanessa. Real bad news. My breath caught in my throat, my heart pounding in my ears, my fingers tightening around the phone like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. How bad? Lucas hesitated, and that hesitation alone told me more than I wanted to know. We don't have enough to arrest him yet, but we've been watching him. He's involved in some serious scams, credit card fraud, identity theft, running fake businesses to launder money. If Madison's mixed up in this, she's in deeper than you think. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me, the weight of his words pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. I had known, deep down, that things were bad, that Jackson was more than just another deadbeat loser. But hearing it out loud, hearing it from someone who knew the kind of people he ran with, made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. Tell me what to do, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the words coming out like a plea. I can't let her go down this path. I can't let her ruin her life over some man who doesn't give a damn about her. Lucas didn't hesitate this time. We set a trap. You let her think she's outsmarting you. You let them get comfortable. And when the time is right, we take them both down. I closed my eyes, inhaling slowly, letting his words sink in, letting the reality of what I was about to do settle into my bones. Madison had made her choices, had burned every bridge I had ever built for her, had thrown away every opportunity one had given her. But she was still my daughter, and no matter how much I wanted to scream at her, to shake her, To make her see what she was doing to herself, I knew one thing for certain. If I didn't stop her, nobody would. And I wasn't about to sit back and watch my own daughter destroy herself. Not if I could help it. Waiting for Jackson and Madison to return felt like sitting in the eye of a storm, the quiet before the chaos, the moment when everything is still, but you know that in a matter of seconds, the wind is going to pick up, and the world is going to start tearing itself apart. I had always been the type to second-guess myself, to wonder if I was overreacting, to convince myself that things weren't as bad as they seemed, but not this time. This time, I knew exactly what I was doing, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was the one in control. Lucas had told me to act normal, to pretend like I hadn't made that phone call, to let them believe that I was the same pushover they had been walking all over for years. That part was harder than I expected, sitting there in my own living room, pretending that I wasn't waiting for them to walk through the door so I could finally put an end to this madness. My hands shook as I cleaned the already spotless kitchen counter, wiping at invisible crumbs just to give myself something to do, something to focus on other than the fact that I was about to do something that would change my life forever. The sound of Jackson's motorcycle pulling into the driveway sent a sharp jolt through my body, like an electric current running through my veins, snapping me out of my thoughts, forcing me back into the role I had to play. I took a deep breath, rolled my shoulders, forced the tension out of my posture, and turned toward the door just as it swung open, Madison sauntering in first, looking as smug and entitled as ever. Jackson followed right behind her, his heavy boots thudding against the floor, his presence filling up the room like smoke, thick and suffocating, making it impossible to ignore him. "Hey, Mom," Madison said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, the same tone she always used when she wanted something, when she was trying to smooth things over without actually apologizing. "I was thinking we should do a little shopping tomorrow. You know, have some mother-daughter time, maybe grab lunch or something." The audacity of her words nearly knocked the breath out of me. The way she could stand there, after everything, after the mess she had made of my life, and act like we were just a normal family planning a casual day out. I forced myself to smile, to nod like I believed a single word coming out of her mouth, to pretend that I wasn't counting down the minutes until all of this would finally be over. "That sounds nice," I said, keeping my voice even, controlled, careful not to let any of the emotions swirling inside me slip through. "It's been a while since we spent some time together." Jackson chuckled, low and amused, like he found the entire exchange entertaining, like he knew exactly what Madison was doing, like he had seen her pull this act before. He draped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her against him like she was a possession rather than a person, his fingers idly playing with the ends of her hair. "You know, Vanessa," he said, his voice smooth, almost charming if I didn't already know what kind of man he was. "Maddie's been telling me how much she appreciates everything you do for her. It's real nice, the way you take care of her, always making sure she has what she needs." My stomach twisted at the blatant manipulation, the way he was trying to play me, trying to butter me up so I wouldn't question whatever scheme they were running this time. I wanted to grab Madison by the shoulders, shake her until she finally saw what was right in front of her, until she understood that Jackson wasn't some great love story, that he wasn't her soulmate, that he wasn't anything but a parasite who latched onto weak, gullible people and drained them dry. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because if I pushed too hard, if I let them know that I saw right through them, then everything would fall apart before Lucas had a chance to do what needed to be done. Instead, I played my part, nodding along, smiling at all the right moments, pretending that I was exactly the fool they thought I was. I let them believe that I had finally accepted their presence in my house, that I had resigned myself to the fact that Madison would never leave, that I would never be free of the burden she had become. I let Jackson sit at my kitchen table, let him prop his feet up on the chair next to him, let him act like he belonged here, like he wasn't just another mistake Madison would come to regret. I let it happen because I knew what was coming next. The trap had already been set. Madison had been stupid enough to steal from me before, had taken cash from my purse more times than I could count, had used my credit card without permission, had convinced herself that I would never actually do anything about it. But this time, I had given her something even more tempting, something that she wouldn't be able to resist. A bank statement, carefully placed on the kitchen counter, with a balance that was just high enough to make her greedy little heart race. A spare checkbook, left in the drawer she always rifled through when she thought I wasn't looking. A password written on a sticky note, left next to my laptop, just waiting for her to take the bait. It didn't take long. That night, when I pretended to go to bed early, I heard them whispering in the living room, heard the rustling of paper, the soft beeping of my laptop as it was powered on. I had already given Lucas a heads up, already made sure that everything they were about to do would be documented, already ensured that the second they tried to transfer money out of my account, the bank would flag it as fraudulent. The moment Jackson hit submit on that transfer, Lucas got the alert. And within minutes, the house was surrounded. The sound of police sirens tore through the night, flashing red and blue lights flooding through the windows, illuminating Madison's face as she realized, too late, what was happening. Jackson jumped up from his chair, knocking it over in his panic, cursing under his breath as he bolted toward the back door, but there was nowhere to run. The second he stepped outside, he was met with a team of officers, their guns drawn, their voices sharp and commanding as they ordered him to get on the ground. Madison was still frozen in place, her wide, terrified eyes locked onto mine, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as reality crashed down around her. "You set me up," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos unfolding around us, the disbelief in her tone almost laughable, as if she truly hadn't seen this coming. I stared at her, my expression blank, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking at my sides, and I didn't say a word. Because there was nothing left to say. Jackson was tackled to the ground, his face pressed against the pavement, his hands yanked behind his back, his shouts of protest drowned out by the sheer force of the situation. Madison, still rooted in place, still unable to process what was happening, didn't even move when an officer grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back as he snapped the handcuffs around her wrists. And just like that, it was over. I had done what I needed to do. I had saved my daughter the only way I could, even if she would never forgive me for it. The house felt impossibly quiet after the police cars pulled away, taking Jackson and Madison with them, their flashing lights disappearing down the street until all that remained was the dull hum of night settling back into itself. I stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the empty road, gripping the doorframe like I needed something solid to hold on to, like if I let go, I might collapse under the weight of what had just happened. For years, I had imagined what it would be like to finally be free of Madison's chaos, of her selfishness, of the never-ending stress that came with trying to keep my life together while she tore hers apart. But now that it had actually happened, now that the house was empty, now that she was gone, I felt something that I hadn't expected. It wasn't regret. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't even sadness. It was relief. For the first time in years, I could breathe without waiting for the next disaster to hit. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing myself for another fight, another tantrum, another mess that I would be forced to clean up. For the first time in years, I felt like my home actually belonged to me again, like I wasn't just some unwilling participant in a life that had spiraled completely out of my control. I closed the door slowly, locking it behind me, letting the silence settle around me like a blanket, letting myself exist in the moment without the constant weight of Madison's presence pressing down on my shoulders. The house was still a mess, chairs knocked over, papers scattered across the floor, the evidence of what had just happened lingering in every corner of the room. But I didn't move to clean it up. Not yet. Instead, I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Jackson had smirked at me like he thought he was invincible, the same table where Madison had laughed in my face like she believed I would never actually do anything to stop her, and I let my head fall into my hands, letting out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in my chest for years. Lucas had promised to keep me updated, had assured me that Madison wasn't in as deep as Jackson, that she wouldn't be facing the same level of punishment, that there was still a chance she could turn things around if she actually took responsibility for what she had done. But I knew Madison, knew the way she thought, Knew that she would spend the entire time convincing herself that none of this was her fault, that she was just another victim in a world that refused to understand her. I could already picture her sitting in an interrogation room, arms crossed, jaw set, refusing to say a word unless it was to blame me for everything. Maybe, in time, she would come to understand why I had done it, why I had made the call, why I had set the trap, why I had done the one thing she had never expected me to do. But I wasn't going to hold my breath. The next morning, I woke up to a house that still felt too quiet, to an absence that was so heavy it felt like a physical presence pressing against my chest. I had spent so many years adjusting to Madison's chaos that I didn't know what to do with the stillness, didn't know how to exist in a space that wasn't constantly teetering on the edge of another disaster. I made coffee in an empty kitchen, sat at the table without having to move aside a mess that wasn't mine, walked through the living room without tripping over discarded shoes or crumpled up fast food bags. It was strange, unsettling, like stepping into someone else's life, like waking up in a version of my world that had been rewritten overnight. Diane, my neighbor, came by later that afternoon, knocking on the door with the same hesitant curiosity that had been written all over her face the night before when the police had swarmed the house. I had seen her watching from her front porch, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line, her expression unreadable as she stood there in the glow of the flashing lights. Now, as I opened the door, she gave me that same look, the one that told me she wasn't sure whether she should be offering condolences or congratulations. "I saw what happened last night," she said finally, her voice careful, measured, like she wasn't sure how I was going to react. "Are you okay?" I almost laughed at the question, at how absurd it felt, at how I had spent so many years living in a constant state of not being okay that I didn't even know how to answer. Instead, I nodded, stepping aside to let her in, motioning for her to follow me into the kitchen, where I poured us both a cup of coffee, my hand steady for the first time in what felt like forever. "I don't know what I am," I admitted, stirring my coffee even though I hadn't added anything to it, watching the dark liquid swirl in slow, hypnotic circles. "I think I'm just tired. But I think I'm finally free." Diane sat across from me, wrapping her hands around her mug, her expression softening in a way that told me she understood, that she had seen enough, had heard enough, had known enough to realize that this wasn't just some overreaction from an overbearing mother. "You did the right thing," she said after a long pause, her voice firm, unwavering, the kind of certainty I hadn't let myself feel until that moment. "It's not easy, but sometimes the only way to help someone is to let them face the consequences of their own choices." I nodded, taking a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest, letting her words wrap around me like armor, letting myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I had done the right thing. Lucas called later that evening, his voice calm, professional, the voice of someone who had been through this 100 times before, who had seen the same story play out with different people, different families, different lives. He told me that Jackson had already started talking, had already started throwing names around in the hopes of cutting a deal, had already begun the process of trying to wiggle his way out of taking full responsibility for his actions. "But Madison? She's not saying much," Lucas admitted, his tone carefully neutral, like he didn't want to push me in either direction, like he didn't want to tell me what to feel. "She's angry. She blames you." I let out a slow breath, my fingers tightening around my phone, my chest aching with something I couldn't quite name. "Of course she does," I said, forcing the words out, forcing myself to accept the reality of the situation. "That's who she is. That's who she's always been." Lucas was quiet for a moment, like he was waiting for me to say something else, like he was giving me time to process, to grieve, to let the weight of everything sink in. But I didn't need time. I had already made my peace with it. "She'll get 5 years, he said finally, his voice softer now, like he was trying to ease the blow. "Jackson's looking at 7 or more, depending on what else we find. But Madison, she'll have a chance to turn things around if she wants to." If she wants to. That was the part that mattered, the part that would make the difference, the part that I had no control over. And for the first time in my life, I was finally okay with that. Am I wrong for feeling relieved that she's finally out of my house, even if it means she had to face the consequences? Will she ever understand that I did this because I had no other choice? Or will she always see me as the villain in her story?